Okay.
My brother Raymond and I visited Eamon's house in Mullingar on one occasion, and I brought a recorder with me, and I recorded a whole long interview, shall we call it, with Eamon about the family, because he was very knowledgeable. All information which came from Minnie Laffey, because she was the one who knew everything about everything that ever happened in the family, and she had passed a lot of it on to him. And he put it on this tape, which is somewhere in this house. I don't know where, but it is. And there's a lot of information on that about the Dooley family and the Laffey family, and where they lived outside Hertford. By the way, Minnie called the house in Galway Kappa Villa because the Laffey house in Farngevna outside Hertford was called Kappa. It's quite a common name, as you probably know, in Irish.
Yeah. I'm interested in the fact that Minnie Laffey ended up with the house even though your grandmother built it.
Oh yes, well, you see, Minnie looked after her until she died, and she was very grateful for that, so she left it. She didn't leave it to John, but I think they had kind of given up on John, because John, as I said, was supposed to take over the business in Galway, and he proved totally inadequate to do that. He was a very charming man and had lots of friends in Galway, but he couldn't control his drinking. I mean, most of the time when we would go to visit him, he would be sober. But when we weren't there, he'd be drinking. And the trouble was, my father, when he arrived back in Galway, he'd start drinking as well. So the visits to Galway were pretty fraught occasions. I wasn't really aware of what was going on to any great extent, because I was quite young. I was about 10 or 12, you know, at that time, the time I'm talking about.
Yes.
But John was very fond of me.
What do you think, though, just before we go off Agnes Dooley for a second, we'll probably come back to her later, but when your grandfather died, she gave a significant portion of her wealth, his wealth, if you like, that he had built up, she gave it to the church.
That's right.
And then when she died herself, she gave what was left to Minnie Laffey, and effectively she never passed on his wealth to any of her children.
No.
Made sure they didn't get it.
As far as I know, she didn't. She didn't.
Isn't that very peculiar? Quite unusual.
She was a very severe woman. Very severe. And they were scared to death about her.
They were scared to death of
her.
Of her.
Yeah. Now they loved their father, who was very easygoing and charming, but he must have had a bit of steel in him as well, because otherwise he wouldn't have been as successful at his business as he was. I mean, to make, let's say, even £1,000, you know, out of that shop in Lombard Street in Galway, the time that he did it, you know, took a lot of doing. Eamon gave me a little cash book from the shop, in which is recorded transactions. For whose account, I don't know. They would have been items sold on credit. But the amounts of money in it, I don't know where it is now, but the amounts of money in it were terribly small, you know, a shilling and 10pence and 6pence for things, tea and sugar and butter and things like that. There's an awful lot of work in building up £1,000 out of that, you know, and keeping a family as well.
Yes, it just seems to be a very unusual set of decisions she made.
Oh yes, she did. Yeah.
Not characteristic of other families, let's say,
No.
where people who had made it in the grocery trade in the late 19th century are the origin of some of the wealthiest families in the country, let's say.
That's right. That's right. Well, you see, my grandfather was a tea expert. The Connemara people, the country people, are even to this day, are very particular about their tea. And he had a very strong tea business. The travellers from London used to come to him twice a year and arrange for the shipping over of the consignments of tea. From the place in London is Mincing Lane, was where the tea merchants foregathered. And they would come to him and he would buy only the best tea. And he had, behind the counter in the shop, there was a row of bins, I suppose you would call them, covered in lacquer and Chinese writing on them. And these contained the tea. And when you went in to buy tea, of course, in those days, you got it in a bag. You bought a pound or a half a pound or a quarter of a pound, depending on your circumstances of tea, and took it off home with you.
Yeah, it wasn't processed at that time at all.
It wasn't, no.
So he was doing the same thing in Galway that the Barrys were doing in Cork.
Exactly. And if John had been a better businessman than he was, he could have done what the Barrys did. You see, I've often thought of that, actually. But anyway, it wasn't to be.
What kind of a man was he then?
Martin
John.
Maloney.
No, John. Yeah.
John. He was a very happy-go-lucky, carefree individual. I mean, he never worked in his life, as far as I know. His father, I don't think his mother had done this. His father had left a trust, of which Jenny and he were the beneficiaries. He was first beneficiary. When he died, it was to go to Jenny. And when Jenny died, it was to come to us, the three children of his son. And that's what happened, actually. I distributed it eventually between the three of us. When I sold the shares, there were, in those days, as you know, you could only have trustee shares in a trust. And what they had, they had one and I think 4% consols. And as a slight variation on them, they had Irish Sugar preference shares. Now I sold the lot and divided it by 3. And Pauline and Raymond and I got £1,600 each out of it.
This would have been in early 70s, am I right? Or
Yes.
late 60s,
Yes.
one or the other.
Yes. So that was the end of the Maloney inheritance.
Yes.
But that was what John lived on.
I suppose Agnes Dooley would have known that that trust existed when
Oh,
she
yes.
made her decisions to
She
give everything else to somebody else.
Yes.
So maybe she thought in her mind that her husband had taken care of the children and that she didn't need to do anything about that.
Possibly, yes. I mean, I don't know what she actually knew or didn't know, but I suspect she did. She did know. Now, the capital value of the thing was, I'd say, never any more than about £3,000. But that was a considerable sum in those days. And John's small income from it. the trustee was his brother Joe. And I eventually, although Joe didn't like me much for some reason, because he didn't like my mother. And he regarded me as my mother's pet. So I wasn't very popular with Joe, but eventually anyway I persuaded him to appoint me as the trustee to succeed him, and he did that. And that's how I came to be able to...
Had he children of his own, Joe?
No.
He had none. So
No.
yourself and Pauline are the only next generation, if I can call it that.
That's right.
Despite the fact there were, was it 4 or 5 children? Which is it for
Well,
Martin Maloney?
There were originally, I can tell you, I have a note in my little book that I took from the grave in the new cemetery in Galway. And when you go in the gate of the new cemetery, on your right hand side there's a row of graves. And one of those, about the 5th or 6th on the way in, is the grave that Martin Maloney bought when the new cemetery was opened. He was one of the first people to have a grave in it, and he's buried in it himself. And in the grave are his children, Bridie Agnes, who died on the 7th of November 1900, aged 3.5. There's his daughter Pauline, died on the 28th of April 1915, age 19. There's himself, who died on the 21st of March 1930, age 73. There's Agnes, his wife, who died on the 15th of June 1932, age 78. There's John, who died on the 27th of July 1964. Oh, died just after his brother, because his brother, my father, died on the 5th of March 1964. And then there's their sister Jenny, who died on the 4th of February 1976. Now I don't know what ages John and Jenny were, because I don't know what their original dates are of birth. But
So if you compare them,
so they're
Yes.
all, that's what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 graves in that in that one grave.
and that's not everybody. So there's 4 children in there, and there's your father is 5, and there's Joe is 6.
Yes.
There was 6 in all. And
Yes.
between the 6 of them, the granted one of them died as a child and one of them died at 19. If there's only 3 in the next generation, and they're PJ Maloney's children.
That's right.
It's extraordinary, really, if you think about it. That number 1, the money didn't follow down through the family, and number 2, the family didn't have children for the most part.
That's right.
That's a very unusual combination.
It is very unusual.
If you compare the personalities now of your brothers, of your uncles, with your father,
Yeah.
Joe and John and PJ, what would you think they were similar or unlike
very,
each other?
Very
Or?
disparate, very unlike each other. The two that were most alike were my father and Joe. Now, Joe was a very competent doctor, first of all. Half the children in North Donegal were brought into the world by him. when he was the doctor in Churchill outside Letterkenny. He was very competent. He was a very aggressive, harsh kind of individual, like his mother, I suspect, to some extent. He had little or no time for virtually everybody else. My father was a much softer person. He was equally clever and had an equal amount of ability in his field, but he was never happy in it, I think. And I think it's possibly one of the reasons why he drank on occasion too much. He really wanted to be a doctor himself, but he had to leave the university after getting his first arts because his father couldn't support him, and he had to get him into the bank and so get him off their hands.
I think he was bitter about that.
I don't think he was bitter. I mean, he wasn't bitter against his father. He understood why it had to be. But he regretted that he wasn't able to pursue the line of activity that he wanted to pursue.
Is there any sort of contradiction between the fact that your grandfather seemed to do so well, but couldn't apparently afford to send one of his sons through medicine?
Well, he could afford to send one, you see. He was
one,
paying
yeah.
for Joe.
And were they near in age? Was he paying for them at the same time?
I would say yes to that, but I'm not sure of when Joe was born. My father was born in 1891, 30th of January. Now Joe was earlier than that, but how much earlier, I don't know. I suppose he was about 2 or 3 years,
Yeah.
you know.
Do you think there's any chance that your grandfather might have had the money but didn't think it was the right thing for your father?
I have no evidence of that whatsoever. I doubt it personally, because the father was a very caring kind of person, you know. And for instance, when I met my cousin Nora Lydon, who lives near just gone out of my head, Moycullen, who lives near Moycullen. When I met her, she had a very strong, there's a word to describe it, something memory, family memory of the man she referred to as Uncle Martin. Uncle Martin was a shining light in the family, obviously, and I'd say he supported them all during the course of his life. And you don't know what kind of draws he had on his money.
Yes. Still maybe a slightly peculiar choice, I would have thought.
What, to send him into the bank?
Yeah, if he really wanted to do medicine.
Well, I don't know, as I
Yeah,
say.
can't get behind it.
I don't know what the pressures were on him,
Yes.
but that was the decision anyway.
Do you think your father was a clever man?
Oh yes, he was very clever. He was. And I mean, he managed his branch of the bank with extraordinary success.
There's different types of cleverness.
Well, there are.
What kind of intelligence do you think he displayed?
That's a very difficult question. I have nothing really to put it to found it on, that idea. I mean, he he knew about everything, and he was interested in everything, and he had a very clear mind, and a very straight sort of person, and very straight opinion. And
Can you think of some examples?
well, there's the outstanding example is the fact that he was prophesying the Second World War 10 years before it actually happened. And he knew what was going on in Britain and in Germany, you know, very clearly. And he was able to deduce from that that the war was coming.
Mm.
And at a time when nobody else, by the way, was thinking about war at all.
Yes.
You know, he was sure it was coming.
So him and
Yeah. He put the bits of money that my mother had inherited, he put them into aviation shares. Armstrong Siddeley and what was the other one? Hanley Page.
Well, that was a wise move, wasn't
You
it?
know, because he expected them to make a lot of money during the war.
Yes.
Now, for some reason or another, it never really happened. I don't know why. Or else he held on to them too long. He made the same mistake that I made later on.
Mm.
And although they had made a lot of money in the war, they went down after the war.
Yes.
So he may have, and then he put her into these Rhodesian Corporation shares.
Mm.
£800 he put into them, which was a lot of money in 1932. It was 2 years' salary for him.
He had, last time we were talking about him now, he just married your mother and they left in Limerick and they and he went off at that point. I can't remember where he went to that you were saying he went to at that point. Do you have any recollection of where he went to in terms of where he lived after that? Did he go back to the Galway area after he got married?
He did, because he and his wife lived in Hertford for a while. He was still in the branch in Hertford, although it had been pretty well blown up by that time. But they managed to keep it going, possibly in a different premises. I don't know that detail. But they lived in Hertford until he was transferred back to Gort.
Still in the Galway area.
Still
Yeah.
in the Galway area, you see.
How long did he spend in Gort?
Well, he left Gort in 1930.
So he was in Gort when you were born. So you were 3 years old when he left Gort.
Yes,
And was he a manager at that stage?
he became a manager on his transfer. He was manager in Dunmore. That was his first branch.
And what age was he then? This was 1891 to 1930. So he was just under 40.
Yes. And when he was made manager in Dunmore, he applied to the bank to buy him a typewriter, which he had for the rest of his life in the bank. But the bank wouldn't hear of it. There was no need for a typewriter. He could write his letters by hand and have them copied, write them in copying ink and have them copied into a book like everybody else. There was no need for a manager of a branch in Dunmore to have a typewriter. So he bought one himself, an Underwood. You see them now on the films, very common, very successful model. I mean, it lasted him from 1930 until 1956. And he had passed it on to his successor in Galway, in Marfeld. So, you know, it's just another example of he was thinking outside the box, really. He wasn't in the box.
Yeah.
He refused to be in the box.
And do you have a sense when he was in Dunmore, did he show that character in the way he ran the branch?
Well, he wasn't in it very long, you see. He was only 2 years in Dunmore. And then he was transferred up to Marfelt.
And was that a new branch when he was transferred up there, or was that a
There
well-established
had
branch?
been one manager in it before him, a man called Collins. And but it was promotion for him, because Dunmore was a very depressed town.
Mm.
I mean, he used to say that although he didn't know the word at the time, looking back on it, he said it was as if Dunmore had been blitzed. It was full of ruins.
What county
and
is Dunmore in?
Houses with no roofs.
What county is it in?
Galway.
Galway, still in Galway, yeah.
So,
So it's a big change then to go to Marfelt. It's a
Oh, that was a
completely
big
different
change.
part of the country.
and well, he had been in Belfast, you see,
He had.
earlier in 1919.
Yes.
And the strange thing was that among the staff, there was a big staff in Belfast at the time, and we used to have a photograph that was taken of the staff with on the wall at the back of the photograph, a photograph of the premises in High Street. So that in this one photograph you had the staff and you had the bank, all in one. But among that staff was an uncle of my friend of years, Paddy McCann.
That's extraordinary.
Extraordinary. And he actually left the bank shortly after the photograph was taken and went back to Cashel to take over the running of the family farm outside,
Uh-huh.
which had been acquired. This is just a detail. It had been acquired by his grandfather, who had gone out to Australia and had made money in the gold mines. And he came back to Ireland and he bought the farm outside Cashel. Now, whether he was from that part of the country or not, originally I'm not sure. But anyway, that's where he bought the farm. And the farm is still there. And as far as I know, there is a McCann still running it.
That's extraordinary.
But
To go back farther, he went to Marfelt in, what year are we talking about now?
32.
32. And he didn't know it at the time, but he was going to spend how many years there?
26.
26 years in Marfelt.
Mm.
That's a long time in one location, isn't it?
Isn't it?
Why do you think he spent so long there? Did he want to stay there?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. He had a very successful career as a bank manager, and he built up the bank to an extraordinary degree while he was there. But number one, he would have had the reputation of being a part-time alcoholic at that stage. Now, the bank was very understanding of people who drank too much alcohol. I knew lots of them later on, and the bank kind of tolerated it. They sort of regarded it as a kind of, it was a necessary
An
fault
occupational hazard,
that had
maybe.
to be, it had to be put up with,
Yes.
you know. But nevertheless, Marfelt was a good place for me because he was out of the way there. Now also, at that time when he was in Marfelt in the 30s and 40s and 50s, the bank was run by this man, Michael J. Cook. And Michael Cook was as far as the customers of the bank were concerned, he was a great manager, because his one object in life was to preserve the bank and its security and its value, and to keep their money safe, and to be always in a position to pay them back their money if they needed it. So from a customer's point of view, he was a very good man. From the staff's point of view, he was ghastly, because he was a tyrant, he was a bully, and everybody feared him. And eventually, of course, he left College Green, and he went off to Old Broad Street in London, and he managed the whole bank, both the English and the Irish side of it, from there.
The headquarters had been there, am I right in thinking? It had always been in London.
Yes.
They had joined the London Clearing Committee and set up their head office in London, but they didn't have a big English branch network, I think.
No.
Is that correct?
No, they had about 15 or so branches in England
Yes.
and Wales. I think they had them in Wales too,
Right.
not in Scotland. But now, you see, he and my father didn't get on at all. And at one stage, the giving of bonuses in the bank was practically unheard of at that time. But one year, my father's results were so outstanding that Cook sent him a bonus at Christmas. And the amount of the bonus was £25. And my father turned around and sent it back to him, which was a terrible insult. Nobody ever would have dreamt of doing